Thank you all for being here. My name is Patrick Heller. I'm the current director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia. And I'm really excited to have Jason Jackson here today. We know Jason well. He comes almost every other year. We have a long-running partnership with MIT as part of the graduate program in development. But today it's really exciting because we're going to be discussing his latest book, Traders, Speculators, and Captains of Industry. So Jason's come down from MIT for the day. And this book came out in December, right after, I forget the order now, but Constructing Economic Nationalism in India and Brazil is also out, right? So
technically that one came out in January.
Oh, okay.
Technically it came out in November. That came out in January.
That's pretty good. Back-to-back books in 2 months. That's pretty amazing. So we're thrilled to have Jason here, and we're really, really fortunate because Rohit Day, for the second time in a year, has come down from Yale. Rohit's a professor in the history department, has written extensively about the Indian Constitution, comparative constitutionalism, was here just last semester for an event, and you're back for, remind me which event it is now, I'm losing.
Down the Constitution.
Yeah, perfect. So another exciting book. So it's wonderful to have you here, Rohit. Thank you for coming back again. And Mark Blythe didn't travel very far, about one floor, I figure. Yeah, well, not even, yeah. And I think everyone in this room knows Mark Blythe, and we're thrilled to have Mark here. Obviously, it's someone who does comparative political economy. I can't think of anyone better to have along with Rohit to be commenting on Jason's book today. So it appears everyone has slides and everyone's got pictures and tables. So this should be a lot of fun. I think it's going to be intellectually stimulating, but I think it's also going to be a lot of fun. And we do have lots of time. So Jason's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll give Mark and Rohit 15 to 20 minutes to comment, and then we're going to open it up. And the spirit of a bookada really is open conversation, deliberation, engagement. This is a topic I think we're all interested in. It cuts across not just South Asia, but it's a great comparative topic. And indeed, the other book is comparative with Brazil. So I hope you'll all participate. And with that, Jason, thank you for being here. Rohit and Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. And Jason, you're on.
Thank you very much, Patrick, first for inviting me down and giving me a chance to have this discussion. Plus, of course, thanks for working with me on our other sort of collaborative joint Brown MIT stuff. And especially big thanks to Rohit and Mark. As I'll note in the presentation, and I think will become clear over the course of this discussion, my work has benefited in really tremendous ways from both Rohit and Mark's scholarship. So I really appreciate both of them coming to join and to share thoughts on the book. That really means a lot. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot of sort of material and there are a lot of slides, but some of which I'll go through quickly. So let's get started. So this book, Traders, Speculators, and Captains of Industry, really was inspired by a research project that began with thinking about economic liberalization, particularly in the 1990s and the 2000s. So in many respects, it falls into a category of a lot of work that focused on economic reforms, economic change in the period of market liberalization, neoliberalism, perhaps, etc. A period that now seems to be in distant memory, but perhaps we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And one of the ways in which my interest in this work was really sparked is really captured to a large degree by this article in The Economist from around 2012 called "Losing Its Magic." And so in this article, so first it's presented initially with this image of a snake charmer floating on a rug. So he's in the sky, so he's floating. And he's charming a snake out of a basket. And the snake is sort of like going up, 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 and then sort of like collapses. So the snake really represents a line graph of economic growth in India in the sort of 1990s and especially the 2000s. And leaving aside it must be said, the sort of very sort of disturbing Orientalism of the image, it sought to tell a story, again, from the perspective of the economist. So this was sort of, the sort of framing was the sort of so-called mystery of India, where the economist was worried about what it saw as fluctuations in India's commitment to economic liberalization over the course of the 2000s, especially. Meaning that India was pursuing these economic reforms and then would backtrack at different periods of time, which created great angst, as you might imagine, for our friends at The Economist. And to try to explain this, The Economist posited two Indias. One which he described as an older India that was mired in slothful growth, mind-bending red tape, suffocating bureaucracy, and ever-present corruption. Sets of ideas that have often been deployed to explain policy reversals, let's say, not just in places like India, but especially in many other developing country contexts. So one hand is one India, but on the other hand, it posited a second India, which it described as a newer land of surging optimism, open and full of entrepreneurs that had been revved up by economic liberalization. Again, really reflecting a set of competing ideas about economic liberalization. Yet, however, The Economist bemoaned that much like, quote, a Bollywood, villain who refused to die, the old India has made a terrifying reappearance, leading the country back to, quote, the rickshaw rate of growth. So what was going on with this depiction that The Economist was positing? So the sort of very specific set of issues that it was focused on within the broader context of economic liberalization and market reforms centered on reforms in the retail sector. Specifically what was known in Indian policy terminology as multi-brand retail. What this basically meant was policies that were being liberalized that would allow the entrance of multinational firms like Walmart and Amazon. And so The Economist goes on, so focusing specifically on what was happening in the multi-brand retail sector, saying, quote, the government announced that it was at last opening its inefficient retail industry to foreign firms, only to change its mind within days. So to take a step back, how was the retail industry in India constituted? Basically, on the front end, meaning where the consumer-facing side, it's populated largely by what are referred to as mom and pop kirana shops. So these are small stores that are ubiquitous across India, particularly in neighborhoods on corners and so forth. But on the back end, much of multi-brand retail focuses on food, and so centers the role of farmers and traders who constitute India's vast and complex agrarian economy. The idea of liberalizing the sector for the Indian government was technology transfer. The idea really was about reforming this sector, particularly the sort of the agrarian sector and its interrelationship with traders, in order to realize scale economies, efficiencies, and so forth. So the idea was that the existing mode of organization was old, traditional, and backward in many ways, and they sought to modernize it through bringing in multinational companies that the government believed had a strong handle on modern technology, especially in the logistics, especially technologies in the logistics sphere. Hence, Amazon and Walmart, right? So global firms that are seen to be dominant in this particular space of having these leading kinds of technologies. These efforts, however, to reform the sector led to massive protests in a variety of ways. Here's one example in front of one of these sort of modern retail outlets. It's worth noting, by the way, that the way in which these retail liberalization actually manifested on the ground was multinational companies coming in and partnering with local companies. And this process, this policy process of facilitating partnerships between multinational firms and domestic companies will be a major theme throughout my presentation, and it's really central in the book. So in this case, Walmart was partnering with Bharti, one of the newer but largest Indian conglomerates. And so this generated massive protests in many ways in these efforts to liberalize this sector. And so again, how was this made sense of? Just to share a few more quotes. On one hand, executives in the Walmart India tie-up argued the following. Said, look, we're willing and able to invest in back-end infrastructure that will reduce wastage of farm produce. Again, this idea that the agrarian food sector was inefficient, will improve the livelihoods of farmers, lower prices of products, and ease supply side inflation, thus saving people money. So basically, what we're going to do is going to be good for everyone, right? And to continue, the economist suggested, look, the Indian government should favor shoppers and not the middlemen who serve them so poorly. So really kind of setting up a kind of stark dichotomy between these firms. On one hand, it'll come in, bringing these technologies and foster this sort of revolution in the retail space, and positing them against the sort of existing incumbent players who are seen as inefficient and wasteful. So let me take a step back just for a moment so we can sort of get a sense of what's the underlying problematic and puzzle and how we should make sense of all of this. On one hand, the retail industry is really being posited as a microcosm of what's referred to as India's desperate politics, shifting party coalitions, and pervasive vote buying, if we're to take The Economist, for example. In fact, but on the other hand, this effort to bring in multinational companies generated this strong backlash, captured, I think, quite neatly in this written statement by representatives from the Confederation of All India Traders. This is in a letter to the Prime Minister, where they argued that Walmart was nothing but, quote, a US version of the East India Company, which had conquered the country. The East India Company and the very long shadow that is cast over India is going to be, again, a recurring theme throughout my presentation. So the underlying question that I want to put forward is the following. Why has foreign investment policy in India oscillated between liberalization and protection, between restrictions on foreign corporations and support for domestic companies? And sort of more generally, how do policymakers make politically charged and technically complex decisions? So this is a general problem. This is a question of how policymaking decisions are made under conditions of complexity and uncertainty, which really runs through comparative political economy. One of the many reasons why it's great to have Mark here to share thoughts on the book, for example. So what's the conceptual approach that I take in this work? Well, we have a set of really familiar and dominant explanations that are often used to explain this process of policy making on one hand, and especially policy reversals. So the politics of the policy making process. And so I'm going to try to organize it just for the sake of our conversation along the lines of our sort of three dominant paradigmatic approaches within the social sciences. So on one hand, we have a sort of liberal explanation, which we could sort of see coming out of a tradition, maybe going back as far as Adam Smith, that really relies on individual self-interest, rent-seeking, and corruption. So in the context of comparative political economy, especially in South Asia, we could think of the work of Jagdish Bhagwati, for example, in this sense. And this is what The Economist is referring to in terms of pervasive vote buying, right? So this sector is fundamentally corrupt. Another approach, another alternative approach is much more structural. So here the focus is much more on competing interest groups. So this is the idea of shifting party coalitions. So as one party gets voted in and voted out, so the cycle between Congress and BJP, more specifically in India in the 1990s and 2000s, could be used as an explanation for these policy reversals. We can think of the work, again, in sort of work in the Indian context in political economy of Pranab Bardhan and Vivek Chibber. And then a third, again, paradigmatic set of explanations might be seen as status institutional, coming from a Weberian tradition. And this has a couple of elements which I'll just point to quickly. So one focuses on the role of state-capital relations, in particular questions of autonomy versus embeddedness, which of course are very familiar to us in the work of Peter Evans, but also Atul Kohli's work as well. So again, this kind of speaks to the sort of desperate politics that were at play. On the other hand, are the role of economic ideas and nationalist beliefs. So to what extent can we use sort of theories of ideas as ways of making sense of these changes, as well as ideas of economic nationalism? And again, if we remember the quote from our colleague or friend from the Confederation of All India Traders, sort of drawing a parallel between Walmart on one hand and the East India Company on the other hand. So very clearly sort of mobilizing a set of nationalist beliefs. So my claim is not necessarily that all of these are wrong. So these are paradigmatic explanations for a very good reason, right? So these are core sort of theories that we use in the social sciences, but rather the fieldwork that I've done, both through interviews and observations in India, as well as archival work, sort of pointed me in a different direction, which is the following. What I'm going to suggest is that Indian policymakers view contentious foreign direct investment policy decisions through what I call moral categories of capitalist legitimacy. Where does this come from? Again, so I'll stick with my theme of paradigmatic sort of explanations. So morality, in the way that I deploy it in this book, is very much Durkheimian. It speaks to the question of what a society sees as legitimate or illegitimate. I should note that morality, for me, and certainly in this book, is very much a terrain of contestation, right? So it's another way to think about the kinds of politics that emerge in the policymaking space. And what I'm going to suggest as quickly as possible here, but I try to detail in the book, is that these categories really are based on long-standing beliefs about the legitimacy of business actors, both foreign and domestic, which is a kind of crucial point. And these can be traced from the colonial period all the way forward. So in the book, I go back a little bit crazily I begin around the 1830s, 1840s. And this became necessary, as I'll say more about in a moment, to really understand where these categories come from, and crucially, why they have so much salience over such a long period of time, such that I argue they still manifest in shaping policymaking decisions today, almost 2 centuries later. To be clear, maybe this is just worth emphasizing one more time, even though I've sort of arranged the sets of theoretical approaches that we might take in addressing these kinds of questions in this sort of paradigmatic way, it's not to say that all of these, of course, are wrong. In particular, I should note that the role of economic ideas is especially crucial in thinking about the ways in which these policy decisions have been made over time. But even economic ideas, especially with respect to foreign direct investment, are fundamentally indeterminate. That is, they're competing ideas about whether foreign direct investment is good or bad. On one hand, some argue that foreign direct investment is good for development because foreign firms bring technology, they bring finance, which of course are crucial for development, especially industrial development, which is a lot of what I focus on. But on the other hand, there's a counter-argument, both of these coming from the economics literature, that foreign direct investment can serve to displace local firms, and so this can lead to sort of local monopolies and inefficiencies in the economy. So again, I turn to alternative ways of trying to make sense of what's taking place on the ground and focusing on this idea of moral ordering. That is the ways in which economies are structured according to moral logics and imperative. And finally, this book is very much rooted in India. But the bigger argument really, I think, is worth just noting and saying kind of explicitly, which is that morality and the way in which moral categories and moral beliefs shape the way in which we think about economies, I'm going to argue is a fundamental feature of modern capitalism. And I'll try to say a little bit about that over the course of my next 15 or 20 minutes, even while focusing very specifically on India. Okay, so let me offer a sort of anecdote, and it's one that I use in the introduction to the book, to sort of lay a bit of groundwork for thinking about this role of economic ideas on one hand, nationalist beliefs, and crucially moral categories. And we're going to do so through the story of Coca-Cola and Thumbs Up. So Coca-Cola, of course, the American global multinational, which in many respects was the sort of archetypical multinational in the period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. That is, it sort of represented Americana, and the sort of like expansion of the American economic empire in the post-war period. You could go almost anywhere around the world, probably in the 50s and 60s, and find Coca-Cola, and India was no exception. The story I want to tell is the following. So in 1977, the guy who you see here on the left, George Fernandez, was a recently elected Janta Party, and he was on a constituency visit, in the summer of 1977 in his constituency in Bihar. And so Fernandez gets to a village in his constituency. And of course, it's India, it's a summer, it's extremely hot. And someone immediately offers him a glass of water once he enters the village. But before he could take a drink, the sort of local village political leader says, no, sir, you can't have that. This is not for you. We have Coca-Cola for you instead. So for Fernandez, whose background was in trade unionism, he's often referred to as a sort of firebrand, trade unionist, this really struck a deep chord. He said, this is really ridiculous. He said, after 30 years of freedom and planning, we have Coke that has gotten to the villages, but we do not have drinking water that the villagers can consume. Of course, the reason why the village political leader stopped him from drinking the water was, of course, the idea that the water was not clean, right? But of course, it's good enough, presumably, for the villagers, but not, for him. And so this really struck a chord with Fernandez. And so he continued. He goes back to his office in New Delhi, and he says the following: I summoned the Coke people and said, look, we have an issue here. Now, what Fernandez is referring to is he goes back to his office and he draws on a recently passed piece of legislation going back to 1974 called the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, FERA. This was an act that was passed under the previous Congress administration under Indira Gandhi. And the idea of FERA basically was to really try to compel technology transfer. It came from a recognition that multinational firms had been let into India in the 1950s and the 1960s, but they weren't doing what was seen as their parts in facilitating technology transfer to local Indian companies. So even during the period of sort of Nehruvian statist developmentalism, which most people tend to think about as dominated by state-owned firms and Indian companies, actually multinational companies had a really important and large presence, especially in more technology-intensive sectors. So the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act was meant to deal with this. And what it did was it required all foreign companies to dilute their holdings in India down to 40%, which in effect meant taking on an Indian partner. And the explicit rationale was to foster technology transfer from the multinational to their Indian partner. Most companies did this, most foreign companies, with two very famous exceptions. One is Coca-Cola and the other one was IBM. So Fernandez goes back to his office. He says, I summoned the Coke people and said, look, you have two options. One is to fold up and leave. The other is to take on an Indian partner and tell him what your technology is. And here the technology that he was really interested in was water purification and logistics, right? So how do you get essentially clean water, of course, with very sugary Coca-Cola secret formula mixed in all around the country. He goes on, it's not just having an Indian partner, it's telling him about your technology. And then he says, since they wouldn't share the great secret of their technology, the only option left was for them to get out. And so Coca-Cola was famously kicked out of India in this period in 1977. Interestingly, IBM was also kicked out as well. We can talk more about IBM later if you want. So what happens when Coca-Cola leaves? Well, all of a sudden, the drinks industry is thrown open. And so a variety of Indian companies enter the fray. And one really rises to the top. Thumbs Up, led by the person who you see on screen, Ramesh Chauhan, who, along with his brother, launched this new brand of Thumbs Up. How many people have had Thumbs Up in the? Yeah, right. So super famous drink. And so it rises to the top, partly on great marketing, especially with this tagline, Taste the Thunder. And Thumbs Up becomes such a success in such a relatively short period of time. By the early to mid 1980s, it's a dominant brand in India and becomes also such a cultural icon as well during the transformations of the 1980s, which I refer to in the book as a sort of period of aspirational consumerism, such that Chauhan is even given a medal by the president of India. So through the 1980s, we see these initial efforts to sort of reform to on one hand, encourage technology transfer. It led to this sort of moment where companies like IBM and Coca-Cola are kicked out. But by the time we get into the 1980s, the economy is really slowing down, and there's an initial effort to start market-led reforms. And this really continues and accelerates after 1991, which for many people who study India is oftentimes seen as a sort of crucial moment. Though I'll note that the economic reforms really began in the 1980s. But nevertheless, there was a sort of medium-sized, let's say, financial crisis in 1991, which led to an acceleration of economic reforms in the country. What was the logic of this acceleration? Really, it's sort of captured in this quote from then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. Singh would, of course, later go on to become a Prime Minister of India about a decade later. But this is when he was Finance Minister. he says, look, the logic of the FDI reforms are essentially the following: to increase the efficiency and international competitiveness of industrial production in India, and for this purpose, to really utilize foreign investment for the purposes of gaining new technologies to a much greater degree than we've done in the past. So again, there's this sort of push, which is a recurring theme in Indian development thinking, that we need more modern, more productive technologies, that these technologies really exist outside of India. And so we have to figure out mechanisms by which to get these technologies into the country. And a crucial mechanism for doing this, not just in India, but this is sort of standard development practice across the developing world, is oftentimes to encourage foreign direct investment, to encourage multinationals to come, hoping that they'll bring their technologies with them. And crucially, not only bring those technologies, but share them as well. So how was this done in terms of actual policy? So foreign direct investment goes from this 40% cap that was under FERA. FERA is now set to the side and is allowed up to 51% in a particular number of what we refer to as high priority industries. These are industries that were seen as more technology intensive, like automobiles, pharma, and so forth. And again, the 51% is really crucial because by liberalizing foreign investment, but only allowing up to 51%, it again necessarily means the idea is that foreign companies will come in and have to partner with local Indian firms. Now, there were some initial concerns, as you might imagine, in this period of liberalization, and Singh addresses those directly the following year. He says, concern is sometimes expressed that the policy of welcoming foreign investment will hurt Indian industry and may jeopardize our sovereignty. So he's highlighting both potential economic impacts. So multinational companies will come in with their greater technologies and displace local firms. But then also sort of more broadly, the sort of issue, the idea that many multinational companies come with the flags of their country, right? So sort of really recognizing the sort of extent to which foreign investment can serve as a threat to sovereignty, which was a common theme across much of the developing world. But he goes on, these fears are misplaced. We must not remain captives of fear to the East India Company. So again, we see the East India Company being, the idea of the East India Company being mobilized again, as if nothing has happened over the past 300 years. India as a nation is capable of dealing with foreign investors on its own terms. And its own terms really means he sort of goes on to argue that we have the policy instruments, the policy tools to ensure that even though we're letting in more multinationals, we'll do so in a way that benefits us. All right, so this is made really quite explicit in this period. Okay, what happens? So foreign direct investment shoots up as a result. So this graph basically shows FDI inflows from about 1980 to 1999. So in the 1980s, you can see some increases in foreign direct investment. A lot of this actually went into the auto sector, especially two-wheelers and light commercial vehicles, which was quite a success in the 1980s. But the real acceleration, of course, takes place after 1991. Right? The dip that you see later around 1997 is the Asian financial crisis. So that was largely external. So FDI inflows grow dramatically. And then a couple of interesting things kind of happen. So from the 1991 acceleration of economic reforms, as I've noted, multinational firms have to partner with local companies to facilitate technology transfer, at least they're supposed to do so. And many multinational companies respond, including Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola comes back in 1992 with 100% ownership, even though, again, all multinational companies were supposed to partner. I'll just say here that I interviewed the person who was the lobbyist for Coca-Cola in the early 1990s, because the sort of general view is that they basically bribed their way in. And I'll just say that he didn't suggest anything that interview would suggest otherwise. They'll put it in those terms. Okay, so Coca-Cola comes back. And of course, because, again, the market has been liberalized more generally, so does Pepsi. So the global duopolists, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, are both now back. Pepsi was already there, but quite small, but both are in India. But along with whom? Thumbs Up. So a question now emerges. How does Thumbs Up, how do local companies respond in a context of global multinational competition in their own market? The concern for the Chauhan brothers, as Ramesh's brother noted later on, sort of using this sort of a bit of this little Indian parable, saying when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. The idea being that when you have two giants that are competing, smaller players will get crushed. As a result, to a large degree of this fear of whether Thumbs Up will be able to survive existing in a market with this competition, they eventually agreed to sell their holdings to Coca-Cola for $60 million. Now, there were competing interpretations of this development at the time. On one hand, there was a sort of idea that India in the 1970s took this very bold policy decision of putting in place these strong foreign direct investment, rules that were very developmental. This is the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. They were designed to compel technology transfer from multinationals to local firms. Again, it's worth saying something perhaps very quickly about the 1970s. On the one hand, it's oil crisis and inflation and so forth globally. But on the other hand, it's also the period of the new, the NIO, the new international economic order, this sort of grouping of developing countries that came together and sort of really tried to chart a path where they'd be able to establish economic sovereignty from the global to the dominant global powers. And it's within this context that the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act was passed. And so one interpretation is that this was a kind of bold policy measure that was put in place during this period when developing countries were seeking to establish their sovereignty. But nevertheless, despite these efforts, countries like India and others were eventually undone by the rise of neoliberalism and the structural power of multinational capital. And sort of like as a kind of support to this in many respects, the reports that at the Thumbs Up sale in Atlanta, Ramesh Chauhan, sort of, and this is a quote from actually the person who later became the CEO of Coca-Cola, who was there at the signing, that he and his wife sobbed at the contract signing. Right? So there's sort of this idea that they're forced by the structural power of global capital to give up their company. That would be a familiar story in many respects. But there was a counter narrative as well, which is really worth highlighting. And that counter narrative is the following: that rather than thinking of the Chauhan brothers as these kind of enterprising entrepreneurs who took advantage of this powerful and bold decision that the Indian government made in the 1970s to establish their own company, using all these really effective marketing techniques, but rather they're simply opportunists who use protection provided by the government to grow and then capitulated as soon as they were faced by foreign competition. So in this respect, rather than thinking about them as these sort of enterprising entrepreneurs, perhaps they're simply just traders and speculators, and not, as some of my interviewees noted, in many ways, not true entrepreneurs. And in fact, Fernandez, in the same set of interviews that I cited earlier from the former Trade Minister, George Fernandez, recalls in the 1990s meeting Ramesh Chauhan and saying to him, look, why did you sell your company? Don't you know that the people of India made you and you sold everything for $60 million? You actually sold India for $60 million. Right? So these are two powerful narrative and counter-narratives that were at play as people sought to interpret much of the emerging politics of economic liberalization in the 1990s and getting into the 2000s. Taking a step back very quickly from Coca-Cola and Thumbs Up, this was a period where we saw lots of other partnerships. So recall the big graph with foreign investment inflows rising. This is really represented by many of these kinds of companies entering and all partnering with local companies. Suzuki and TVS, for example, in two-wheelers, Hero and Honda, Mercedes-Benz and Tata Motors, Danone and Britannia. And I cite these specific examples not just because they're major multinationals partnering with many big Indian companies, or because many of them are in the auto sector, which is the sector I focus most on in the book, but also these would later become many of the most contentious joint ventures as the 1990s turned into the 2000s. So what were some of the issues that emerged that made them contentious? Well, there was the following. After this initial period of growth, we started to see a backlash emerging from many Indian industrialists. Many will recognize the person standing on the right. That's Rahul Bajaj, the sort of head of the Bajaj Group, which famously was the dominant producer of scooters in India through a license with the Italian firm Piaggio. So Bajaj and a number of other leading Indian industrialists got together at first secretly, but then they were discovered. They used to meet at this in this particular room at the Oberoi in Bombay, called the Bombay Club, and hence the sort of idea that they became referred to as the Bombay Club, once discovered by a very keen journalist. And after discovery, they sort of wrote a letter to the Prime Minister saying the following. First, they tried to do a number of key things that are worth pointing out. One is establishing themselves or making a claim that they are willing and able to be the agents of economic growth, industrial transformation, and growth in the 1990s. They say, look, the aim of Indian industry is to be as competitive as any of its peers in the world. Its vision is that it becomes multinational and, in fact, a world player, and to play their rightful role in the industrial development of the country. But they note Indian industry, in order to do this, needs a conducive environment that allows it to raise resources competitively, and which addresses itself to the issue of stakeholding, that is, ownership and managerial control in the joint ventures that were emerging in the 1990s, so that there's additional incentive for growth and capital formation. So what do they mean by this very quickly? So on one hand, when he says that allows it to raise resources competitively, what he's arguing is that one of the critiques that emerged was that Indian companies and multinational companies face an uneven playing field because multinational companies could raise finance cheaply on global markets and Indian companies couldn't. So in a joint venture, there was a disparity to the extent that multinational companies were able to expand and sort of contribute more money to grow the business versus Indian companies. And this disparity led, as liberalization continued through the 1990s, to multinational companies taking greater and greater stakes in the firm because Indian companies couldn't keep up with the investments. The Bombay Club sort of critique expanded a couple of years later in 1996 with, again, a sort of another famous letter that was written then by Tarun Das, who was head of the Confederation of Indian Industry, where he again cited a set of complaints from Indian companies about their multinational partners. 6 key points that he makes. He says, look, these multinational companies come into India and take a sales approach as distinct from manufacturing. I'll come back to this sort of distinction between sales and manufacturing. They focus on short-term profits rather than long-term gain. They refuse to bring in state-of-the-art technologies or the most modern products. They want to quickly expand their holdings and sort of take over the joint venture. And crucially, 6 is my favorite, they take a, quote, cowboy approach of landing in India, hastily choosing a partner, making a mistake potentially, and then wanting to break the relationship, right? So this sort of idea that these multinational companies are sort of aggressive, unethical business partners that have no real desire to work on an even basis with their Indian partners, but rather just want to gain as quickly as possible monopolistic or oligopolistic control. So in my fieldwork in India, much of what I focused on in the initial period was trying to make sense of these competing claims that were being made by different actors in India. And one of my most interesting and illuminating interviews was with a senior government of India official who said the following, sort of in asking him, how do we make sense of these kind of competing claims about Indian companies? He made a very interesting distinction. He said with the 1991 reforms, there are a number of new players, Indian players who are allowed to enter industry. And he notes that these players are just traders. They said to themselves, look, here's an opportunity because the market is being opened up. Because multinational companies that want to enter India have to do so with a partner, it means that multinational companies come in and have to search around and find an Indian company that's willing to work with them. So this is, from the perspective of this official, constituted an opportunity for Indian companies where they could say, I'll just partner with this multinational, I'll put in a little bit of money and I'll just ride along. And crucially, he said they weren't interested in absorbing technology. They weren't technology types. They were just traders, really. So the idea is that they're taking advantage of a policy rent that's being created by the government, which requires multinational companies to find a local partner, but they didn't really care about getting technologies. They didn't really want to do the things that the government really hoped the policy would achieve, which is facilitate this technology transfer from foreign companies to local partners. And so what I want to point to here are sets of deep moralized tensions that are at play. This question on one hand of will foreign firms be developmental on one hand, or will they just be new East India companies? On the other hand, there's a competing tension, which was the following. Does India have the right type of capitalists? That is, will local firms approve to be traders, speculators, and money lenders, or will they be true captains of industry? And this is a sort of key distinction that I found running throughout first my fieldwork and then increasingly the archival work that I did as I tried to make sense of these categories that many of my interlocutors were deploying between, on one hand, trading orientations and production orientations as two distinct ways two distinct, let's say, logics that govern the ways in which Indian capitalists, but then also foreign capitalists as well, operated. Okay, so let me take a step back and try to summarize this in a 2x2. This is my political science move in many respects, and then I'll stop. So in the book, I tried to organize these competing, these two sets of distinctions that are being made, trading orientations on one hand and production orientations on the other, in terms of these categories of what I refer to as traditional and modern business actors and practices. And these crucially cut across both foreign, the sort of boundary between foreign and domestic. Which I'll just note very quickly from the perspective of working on economic nationalism, that oftentimes we'll see, of course, multinational firms as sort of, rapacious actors, operates just as much for Indian companies and vice versa. So I argue on one hand that many foreign firms were seen as sort of neo-imperial East India companies. And this was counterposed against Indian companies that were sort of true captains of industry. And so the idea is that oftentimes when these two types of companies are in partnerships, there's a fundamental tension between the two. As the Indian firm wants to get these new technologies, but the foreign multinational refuses to share them. In many respects, this is a kind of common story, or this is familiar to us maybe from much work on the political economy of development. On the other hand, another element which I think is much less familiar and really comes from thinking about these underlying tensions about Indian firms and Indian capital and whether they're the right kind of capitalists. I mean, again, this goes to work that people like Rohit has done, as well as other colleagues like Nasser Tyabji, Ritu Birla, and so forth. So it really questions this question of Indian firms. On one hand, it recognizes that foreign firms can oftentimes be developmental partners and technology providers. That is, it is the case that multinational firms oftentimes can and do play their role as sort of good business partners, right? Bringing finance, bringing technology, and enabling technology transfer across the foreign-domestic firm divide. But in these cases, oftentimes they're partnered with Indian companies that are merely traders and speculators, right? That have no real desire to learn these new technologies, but as my interlocutor who I cited a few moments ago noted, are just joined these joint ventures and are just along for the ride. So I could say more about where these categories come from, why they have so much salience, and draw on the ways in which both they align with, on one hand, deep underlying tensions in modern capitalism that I argue go all the way back to Bernard Mandeville and the fable of the bees, the sort of fundamental question about whether business actors' practices are good or bad for society. So the sort of fable of the bees, famously private vices, public benefits, sort of citing this underlying question that really animated much of late moral philosophy and early classical political economy as these observers, writers observe the rise of modern capitalism. As well as the ways in which they manifested in colonial contexts like India, were these four categories that I note here. On one hand, these neo-imperial East India companies, which were followed with the demise of the East India Company in the 19th century by the emergence of British managing agencies, which are new firms on one hand, but which carried out many of the same kind of merchant trading practices and governed emerging industry in India in ways that were seen as unethical and extractive. As well as where these sort of ideas of these emerging captains of industry in India come from, and the sort of idea of these sort of traditional traders and speculators in India. So I'm happy to say more about those later, but I will resist the temptation to do so now, and instead just conclude by saying something about the structure of the book. So the book is structured into 8 chapters, and it proceeds historically, which is something we can talk about more after. Sort of joking with Mark and Rohit before the talk about the decisions that I made when I was writing the book and whether to sort of present it historically or in other ways. But the first 2 chapters basically cover the period from around 1830 to 1920. It focuses on one hand on the period of the demise of East India Company governance, and crucially the rise of the British managing agencies, which I just mentioned, a very particular kind of corporate organizational form that was crucial, that played a crucial role for better and worse in many respects in late 19th and early 20th century India. And the core question here is about the capitalist transition in this period, both with the emergence of these particular kinds of British capital, as well as the transition of the question of whether Indian merchant and trading capital would transition to be manufacturing players. And here I sort of focus on this sort of an anxiety about traditional Indian economic man. The next couple of chapters of the book focus on the early part of the 20th century and a variety of anti-colonial agitations and specifically contestation between different forms of economic nationalism. For example, between Gandhi and Nehru. And the core issue here is really thinking about, first, economic nationalism as contested. So there is no such thing as Indian economic nationalism as a singular belief, but rather there are multiple nationalisms, and these exist in contestation with one another. And a kind of crucial question was, which nationalism would prevail and what kinds of policy implications would it have in the post-1947 independence, post-1947 independence, early independence period. The third part of the book, chapters 5 and 6, focus on an array of societal conflicts that emerged, particularly in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This is the period, for example, after Nehru died, when Indira Gandhi became prime minister. It covers the period of the emergency, and crucially periods like the emergence, the sort of kicking out of Coca-Cola and the emergence of Thumbs Up that I noted before. And then finally, I conclude in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s by highlighting the kinds of business politics that I see as dominating this sort of period of economic liberalization as a way of really showing how these sets of ideas and moral beliefs that have this very long history were made manifest in the course of the kind of contestation we saw both at the policy level and between business firms in this space. Again, the kind of crucial question, once again, was the following. Are multinational firms really developmental? Are they good partners and technology providers? Or are they just simply extractive sort of new East India companies on one hand, but then also the tension that sort of went with it, the crucial corollary, were Indian companies not just seen as all necessarily sort of budding potential industrialists, but rather were they traders or speculators or captains of industry? And these anxieties, I argue, really operate at the core of trying to help us to make sense of the sort of complexity, the sort of mystery of India that I began with as framed by The Economist. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Did we work out an order? 15?
You have pictures. I have a couple of, I have some videos.
Yes.
So thank you again for inviting me to part of this. Jason and I actually met, I think, very early on in graduate school at a grad student conference, and our work's been in conversation ever since, and I've learned so much from this. This is really a tour de force of a book. It combines over 200 years of Indian history, and while focusing on the key question of moral orders of legitimacy, it also offers us really synoptic, vivid, and fairly thorough account of Indian history and politics. So I'll begin with some opening remarks. I'll probably pause to stage a kind of cultural intervention, and then I have sort of 5 questions to sort of open up the discussion with. So Moral Orders of Capitalist Legitimacy is a rich, vivid, original, sophisticated intervention into understanding India's economic development and policy. It offers a truly original and compelling method to think through questions of political economy and development that scholars of other regions can learn from. In some ways, though the book covers a long period, it really turns to a key question that has dominated histories and policy studies of India. How does one explain the fragmented nature of India's economic reforms, liberalization, and growth? So, faced with the balance of payments crisis in 1991, the Indian government reverses seemingly decades of protectionism and statist economic policies and liberalizes the economy. For scholars of the 20th century economic policy, this seems to be a familiar story, very similar to how it plays out in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. However, the Indian government, civil society, and even Indian industry resists and modifies the speed and extent of structural adjustment that other states had to undergo. As scholars of Indian welfare, including Patrick, have pointed out, even when the Indian economy undergoes its most neoliberal form in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it's accompanied by an expansion of state services and increased welfare spending. Dominant accounts of India's liberalization take sort of one of three strategies. One is dominated by journalists and actual participants. It sort of goes over the twists and turns in the negotiation and focuses really on these individual heroes or bargainers. Scholars of political economy like Pranab Bardhan or Vivek Chibber look at a much longer history of post-colonial economic regulation and argue that this is a result of the sort of thwarted nature of class formation in India and the limited amount of state capacity the Indian state has. Essentially, what there is a kind of block dialectic where a certain kind of class is not able to capture the state in its entirety. And even when they dominate the state is not strong enough to push out other competitors. Finally, there's a small emerging group of historians of economic thought and development, David Engerman, Aditya Balasubramaniam, Srinath Raghavan, who draw on the economic philosophy and intellectual genealogies of key participants in the process, be it Manmohan Singh, Indira Gandhi, or Mahalanobis. Jason offers us a new framework to understand these seemingly contradictory economic policies by emphasizing what he calls moral orders of capitalist legitimacy that take seriously the ways in which political actors categorize and classify market participants, policies, and practices, applying moral meanings to them. Drawing on Durkheim, he argues these are not conceptions held by individuals, but widely shared categories that structures how actors behave in and engage with the market. To uncover this, he shows how certain assumptions and binary categories, as we saw in the slide at the end, are rooted in a much longer genealogy, challenging the reading of India's post-colonial economic history as being centered around ideological framework, socialist versus market-friendly, or around protectionism, pro-anti-foreign investment, but really about certain moral conceptions of economic behavior, particularly the idea of who a modern economic actor is. It really is a kind of Pollyannesque book. As I mentioned to Jason earlier, the first third of the monograph engages with the emergence of Indian economic nationalism. It's a kind of broad terrain, the tension between Gandhian and modernist visions of economic nationalism, emergence of the idea of an Indian homo economicus seems to cover familiar ground. For example, putting out the tensions between the Gandhian and Nehruvian visions of the economy. But as Jason shows, both seemingly contradictory visions are rooted in a shared nationalist belief about India's glorious pre-colonial past and are oriented against colonial orthodoxies projected towards the construction of an alternative future. This disrupts the conventional approach that frames Gandhi's thoughts as being rooted in a local moral economy, while Nehru sort of reproducing a kind of Western socialist model. The book parses through many archival sources from legislative debates, industrial lobby groups, advertisements, financial accounts, planning, etc. I just want to sort of turn to before I think the key point made by the book, its most major intervention is really trying to think through the economic liberalization of the 1980s and 90s. It's able to explain why the regime, including right and left-wing opponents of liberalization, came to increasingly see the turn towards global market forces as the way through which India would achieve its status in the global order, transforming nationalism away from protectionism towards outward-oriented economic growth. By the 2000s, there was a sense of increased self-confidence amongst Indian business elites, with some of them seeing themselves as global Indians rather than just an Indian economic man. He persuasively tracks the rising political support for liberalization through the emergence and deployment of aspirational consumerism through the 80s and 90s, allowing political parties to build legitimacy through new cultural scripts. I found his engagement with the visual archives of advertising in the 1980s to be particularly compelling. And my only regret is that there isn't more of this in the earlier part of the book. And because of the conversation of Coke, I just wanted to pull up a couple of examples. So this is the original. So, Jason talked about Coca-Cola, which is the kicking out of Coca-Cola and the rise of Thumbs Up. Parley, which sort of produced Thumbs Up, in the early 80s launched a new lemon drink called Limca. So I'm just going to play the original Limca launch ad, and maybe we can talk a little bit about it.
If you want some fun and frolic, take one chilled bottle of Limca. Open it, take 2 straws, flatten them end to end, and what a lovely sound. Chuck them over your left shoulder, drink Limca straight from the bottle. Ah, Limca, it's very, very lime and lemony.
So if you think of the kind of imagined consumer of this product and sort of Jason's argument about a kind of Indian company trying to take over from Coca-Cola, what do you think this ad is trying to do? we have maybe half a minute for responses. Or how does it imagine it's sort of the average Limca drinker? What is it trying to sell it as?
Selling it to young consumer-oriented Indians.
Yes, and
Everyone in the background.
who are presumably able to understand English and are sitting in what looks like a cafe or outdoor event. This is a much more recent ad, and it comes at a time when, as Jason mentioned, Coca-Cola came back, found it couldn't really compete with Thumbs Up, had initially just bought up their bottling system and eventually launches Thumbs Up under its own kind of banner. So Thumbs Up is now a Coke-owned brand, as is Limca. And until recently, they used to outsell both Coke and Pepsi in India. So this is a more recent ad coming from a multinational company marketing Limca. So
ओ गोरे गोरे ओ बाकी छोरे कभी मेरी गली आया करो
ओ गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो
जब तक गोरे गोरे ओ बाकी छोरे कभी मेरी गली आया करो
गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो
लिम्का चढ़ा ले ताजगी.
So what's changed in the imagination of this consumer, or how has the company rebranded itself?
Trying to be slightly less patriarchal.
It's there's not a man who's dictating stuff. There is almost no English in the advertisement except for at the end when it writes out a Hindi slogan in a Roman script. It's staged in a kind of ordinary Indian gully. It's a scene from everyday life. There is an attempt to make it look different, and it's sort of using old Hindi film song. It's a kind of old courtship ritual, and it's almost it doesn't even try to emphasize its Indianness. Limca is just an ordinary part of everyday life, but this Limca is part of the global Coca-Cola chain. The original Limca we saw was India's Parle trying to launch a brand. So I think one of the questions that really comes up is, what do the categories Indian and foreign, global or local sort of really mean when we are thinking through changes in Indian political economy? So I want to sort of pick up on sort of five questions that I think the book throws up. The first is a very persuasive case of thinking of India as method. So unlike many other works in political economy, which sort of treat India as a case study compared to South Korea or to other places, the book very persuasively makes a case for treating India itself as a site that's generative of theory, picking up in some ways from a kind of challenge laid out by Partha Chatterjee, that instead of sort of working with universalizing European historical models as ways to think through social science, really building theoretical models from the historical experiences of everywhere else. It makes also a case to think through economics as a battleground of ideas as well as interests, and engages with the colonial past, not just with the immediate present. It's a reminder to economists that economic history is not just a marshalling of data sets, but to think about intentionality, ideas, creativity, and legitimacy. As he shows, the rise of economic nationalism produces distinct model categories of capital and legitimacy that can be applied not just to the Indian context, but as various references show, to Gilded Age America, to contemporary Brazil, and to think of the ways in which the state uses regulatory and legal tools to order capital is also something that we can trace in sort of other sites. India is in many ways both an exemplary, but also a sort of testing ground for the post-colonial state. Because of its scale and its size, it sort of highlights several of the tensions that we see happening in other places. The second kind of key set of actors that Jason brings to the foreground as a kind of force in history as such is what he describes as policy elites. In the introduction, he says these include government officials, firm managers, consultants, lawyers, lobbyists, journalists, and academics. And I think the question I had was, is this category stable across the period of time that he's looking at? Who are these people? Have they always existed? What role do they play in setting the discourse, and is the role equal? And I think at various points of time, I think in one of his interlocutors says, well, all of these debates are actually happening in the financial papers, right? This is a space of free speech and discussion. When do financial papers become a kind of big site in India, right? When is it that the head of FICCI thinks writing in the financial papers is going to get him the audience that he wants? Who is he trying to persuade when they do that? Have pink paper journalists always existed in India, or are they really like a 1980s phenomenon? And I think this becomes clear if we sort of contrast this with the work that's coming out in colonial India. So here the figures are nationalist leaders, an occasional scientist, maybe a businessman, and they are writing and making their claims in the absence of representative institutions, right? And there's a larger argument that the turn towards economic nationalism really emerges as a kind of problem of representation. So Indian nationalism is not oriented towards a linguistic or a religious identity. It really picks up on economic underdevelopment as a category to stage itself, and therefore making a claim on the economy is central to sort of projecting a certain kind of nationalist politics. But after independence, you have a system where you have a mechanism for representation. And so how do these figures, particularly planners and people who don't hold elected positions, attempt to position themselves in this market? There's a little bit of work on the rise of experts. David Engelman's recent book, for example, on development economists, or the work on the Planning Commission, makes certain gestures to this as to why economic questions were seen as questions of economic policy should not be settled by electoral politics. I think Jason's book cuts against that by actually putting some of the democratic politics alongside the policy changes that are happening. It's quite clear that the Planning Commission or Mrs. Gandhi is not just deciding things based on a technocracy, it's going hand in hand with the kind of reorientation of politics. And I think the question that I was hoping to see more of in the conclusion was really this question of democratic representation, right? So if you go back to like the original diagnosis that Bardhan and others make, the kind of block dialectic of the Indian state is the inability of the Indian bourgeoisie to achieve a certain kind of hegemony over state and society. This is because, in the absence of one dominant class, the state becomes a kind of mediating force between them. But the state, unlike Gilded Age America or other places, also a state that has to periodically seek a kind of electoral referendum, right? So when we go back to the question of legitimacy for whom? And it's quite clear that some of the legitimacy is about electoral legitimacy. It's not just capitalists talking to each other or intellectuals sort of presenting ideas. These ideas have a certain kind of popular purchase. And again, I think the archive that your work makes visible, some of the others don't look at, is the kind of archive of legislation. FERA just sort of usually represented as, there were attempts of Mrs. Gandhi to, pursue her political rivals or sort of pursue a dominant socialist agenda. But I think sort of what you gestured towards, it's actually a way of disciplining certain forms of capital who are perhaps backing opposition parties at that point of time. So tied to this, of course, is the idea of consumption citizenship. And I think the kind of ads sort of tried to engage with how it changes. What are the implications really of a consumption citizenship? And is it something that's achieved? There's a much older kind of question going back to Adam Smith, which suggests that consumption is a fundamental basis of an economic system. In fact, the critique of many economic systems is that they don't leave enough for people to sort of engage in that consumption economy. It's a little... I think it might be to think about like whether the kind of aspirational consumption citizenship of the 1980s was ever achieved, and when it was achieved, did it take the form that Gandhi and others would expect? My kind of legal historian brain got really excited by the section on joint ventures. It's a kind of new area of work that most scholars of Indian economy don't go into in much detail. So since Jason outlined it, I won't go into it in full detail, but I want to flag that the question of joint ventures was always a thorny one. What was seen to be a kind of partnership that would lead to a transfer was often viewed by both sides with suspicion. And some of these tensions come out with the issuing of Press Note 18 in the late 90s, early 2000s, which basically makes it very difficult for the international partner to walk away from the joint firm. It tries to set the terms of agreement in favor of the Indian partner. And there are two sort of interesting figures that appear in this debate. One is Amit Mitra, who is then the chairperson of FICCI, who makes the argument that this is necessary to ensure that the kind of joint ventures are ones that would build Indian economy, protect Indian industry, and sort of lead to and check against kind of adventurous foreign firms. The response to this is not a response about the response to this is framed not in, it's trying to create a new form of legitimacy. It comes from Pallavi Shroff, one of India's leading corporate lawyers, who kind of counters this sort of seemingly nationalist argument by deploying a set of liberal legal ideas. She says, for example, this note restricts the foreign investor's right to business. It's not a right that's in the Constitution, but she assumes it's a certain kind of right. It allows the state to legislate in matters of contract, which should be something that is in the private domain of the market. It creates unequal and disadvantageous positions of foreign investors, suggesting the doctrine of equality is not just applicable to citizens, but also to economic players, and raises legal and interpretational issues. And I think there's a lot to unpack in this moment. So if you just begin with the two actors themselves, Amit Mitra is a MIT-trained economist who taught at Duke and then went back to lead FICCI. Post his tenure here, he resigns and joins the Trinamool Congress and becomes West Bengal's finance minister, defeating the Marxist economist finance minister in an election where Mitra is seen as left of the communists. Pallavi Shroff is one of the managing partners of India's leading corporate law firms. She's also Jagdish Bhagwati's niece. And interestingly, while she had this to say about JVs, India's law sector is one that remains resolutely close to foreign investment. And the firm that she leads was quite vocal until recently in saying that we cannot let foreign capital or foreign firms in to the legal sector because the legal sector seeks to remain Indian. So there's a lot to sort of unpack here, but I want to suggest that some of the policy actors that we read as one category actually have diverse interests at play. They are responding to different kinds of groups and incentives. And you can also have someone like Pallavi Shroff, who one could easily say, oh, she's representing the interests of foreign corporations, also plays the kind of moral legitimacy game when it deals with questions in her own sector. There is an interesting story through the book about the role that corporate law and financial regulation plays. And really, by the early 2000s, a lot of this has been taken out of the Indian legal system and, like everywhere else in the world, being turned into kind of global arbitration system. And I'm wondering whether that actually makes some of the stakes in these arguments matter less now. And finally, I want to sort of end with a question about the present. So the reading of the current Indian government here seems to sort of bolster initially Jason's larger argument. Jason points to the language around demonetization and farm laws and connects it with a much older sort of philosophy of the BJP going back to Guru Murthy that critiques certain forms of foreign capital coming in as disruptive of Indian culture. It rebrands a sense of Swadeshi economics, which is tied to a certain kind of traditional Indian morality. And in some ways, both these moves are presented in that light. It's also a case that one can make with, as Jason does, picking up on Jairus Banerjee's argument about it's not necessary that in every society industrial capital overtakes agrarian capital. In many cases, like in India, it's actually commercial capital that's trying to find its way around. But all of this is before the latest deal with the US, where in a kind of step back from many years of sort of policy consensus, the Indian government seems to have agreed to open up large sectors of the agricultural sector, remove tariff barriers and protections on what were sort of its most tried and tested sort of local constituencies. And there are multiple explanations being offered for this, but the one key one is it goes back to this idea of sort of crony capitalism, that these are moves that actually help certain firms that are well embedded in the Indian establishment, but also have key interests outside. And in a way, if we go back to the original part of the book, there is a sense that the East India Company unproductive capital model is the bad model, and legitimacy is only claimed by framing capital as modern and productive. But it seems that not just in India, but worldwide, it's actually the trader model of capital that seems to have won. Private equity is not productive. It is something that moves easily between one place and the other, and it can be very easily caricatured as this kind of sort of East India Company project. So at the end of the book, I think, and perhaps it's unfair to ask the question after we've covered such a long period, how do we end up with this moment? Is there no constituency for whom this legitimacy, I guess, would matter? And if I just have maybe a minute, I'll just play another ad and maybe I'll end with that. So this is only because Jason had Rahul Bajaj in the framing, and this is the original, I think, Bajaj ad when they had a JV with this Italian scooter company and they launched the Bajaj Scooty.
ये ज़मीं ये आसमां ये ज़मीं ये आसमां हमारा कल हमारा आज हमारा कल हमारा आज बुलंद भारत की बुलंद तस्वीर हमारा बजाज बुलंद भारत की बुलंद तस्वीर हमारा बजाज
So if again, quick pop culture read of this, the ad line basically says independent India's independent picture, or free India's sort of free image. How is it trying to position the Bajaj Auto? It's ours. It's a part of ubiquitous part of everyday life. It's something that it's a family object, and it kind of skims through various different Indian communities in this. So in about 10 years, Bajaj faces a kind of problem because cars are much more available and scooty sales are falling. And this is a part of their rebrand. And what is interesting is that they keep much of the original song, but they change the way it's played.
हमारा कल नया है आज हमारा आज नए भारत की बुलंद भारत की नई तस्वीर बुलंद तस्वीर हमारा बजाज हमारा बजाज हमारा.
Yeah, so if you think of this as a kind of imagined new consumer citizen, how does this change? What changes in 10 years? Sorry to put this spot, Jason.
Individual,
Yeah.
gender,
Yeah.
sort of play with culture, like traditional, like religion and culture.
It's basically Hindu. The last one had like a smattering. They had Parsis and Muslims, but this is just entirely Hindu. It's also interesting that they're all wearing distinctly Western clothes, but they do this kind of genuflection to show that actually they're sort of connected to the religious roots. So it's this argument that we are now global. You can be like a biker gang, but you are not going to upset a Rangoli as you drive past. And I think that goes back to that term that your book uses, which is really legitimacy. And I think at various points of time that legitimacy for whom seems to change. And I think that's one of the kind of interesting questions this book opens up, that who are these capitalists seeking legitimacy from at various points of time? So, thank you again. It was really a privilege to get to read and engage with this.
Right. That's great. Mark. I will be massively short. Whoops.
There we go. Oops, wrong one. Thank you. Come on. There we go. All right. So first of all, thank you for the invitation via Patrick to do this. It reminds me anytime that I engage with the literature on India how little I know. And it's not just me, it's sort of the whole of comparative political economy, right? There's this huge economy, right? And we know tons about China these days. We've known tons about Japan forever. We've all been raised on the developmental state literature, et cetera, et cetera. But India is the sort of like, I don't know. That's it. And it's funny because when you go through this book, which I described earlier as sort of of Olive Coley, sort of compressed down in a sort of much more digestible form, you do know a lot. It turns out you do. But one of the great things about the book is precisely because it takes this kind of evolutionary perspective over like 120 years, that you get this sort of like, oh, there really were these distinct phases. Right, there really were these distinct periods. These distinct periods were not somehow cut off to everything else that was going on in the world. They're actually very much integrated into it. So it's great just to read it, just for the empirical material, right? So for that, it's great. But more than that, thankfully, there's also this. So the moral orders of capitalist legitimacy argument. I want to play with this, and I also want to use the 2x2 tables that are in the book that was put there by, obviously, the publisher, who at certain points couldn't follow the argument and insisted that there had to be 2x2 tables. And that's pretty much correct. Yes, that's what happened? Yeah, well, okay, fair enough, right.
For better or worse.
For better. I actually think for better, because there's a way, and I've edited them slightly to basically give a sort of mini flow through the whole thing. So what are these moral orders of capitalist legitimacy? I think it's more than just legitimacy. Legitimacy is kind of the surfaced, correct, but surfaced variable here. That is to say that any society has a view as to what is appropriate economic conduct, what counts as reasonable exchange, what are the standards by which we measure these things, etc. And the sort of the tyranny, if you will, of Western liberalism qua sort of homo economicus is to have a world in which none of that matters. Right, that basically, if you think about sort of general equilibrium theory, the core, if you will, of all modern macro in any form, there's no time. Right, time doesn't exist. Transactions are basically just things that occur in a sort of a vector space. There's no profits because everything's competed away. That everything's perfectly integrated. There's no past, there's no future. It is essentially a sort of a beautifully historical space populated by consumptive individuals. And that makes for great modeling, but obviously does great violence to what we're trying to actually understand, or at least some of us are trying to understand. So but the first thing is, I think moral orders act as evaluation devices. And this is the way it's played in the book, that there's basically good capitalists, bad capitalists, good capitalism and bad capitalism. And that's basically one of the things it structures. But there's another sort of slightly deeper one, which fleets in and out of the book. And the first one is moral orders as uncertainty reducers. That is to say, if you're a post-colonial society emerging from, 120 years of British, shall we call it, influence and extraction, what do you do next? Right? Like thinking through that moment, particularly in the context of partition, is absolutely enormous. Thinking through this in the context of World War II, the build-up of the domestic economy, despite the fact that the Brits constantly said you couldn't do it, but they needed India to do it because of the war effort, what that did to domestic capital, all of the sort of like this ferment that creates this uncertainty that then basically leads to the two stories. One is basically the Gandhian move that re-emerges in the self-sufficiency move, and the other one is Nehru, and this very sort of caricatured version of Nehru, we have a sort of planned state socialism, what was actually much more rich and much more open than this. And then with that along comes group signaling. And this is basically sort of how certain ethnic minorities are deemed to be bad capitalists, speculators, etc., the kind of more than cultural tropes that fit into this kind of idea of uncertainty reduction and group signaling. Another way to do it is, as you put it in the book quite strongly, is that moral orders are how states build markets. But they're also, and this is something that Otto Colley's picked up and other people have picked up on, it's also that developmental state, very, very late developers, you have to build capitalists. Right? To the extent that they exist, they're in short supply. And one of the key claims in the book is they may be of the wrong type. Right, so there's something there which is deeply and irreducibly cultural, right there, that's very, very important. This leads to two moral frames, the domestic moral frame, which you didn't talk about in your presentation, but I think is central to the book, this notion of Indian economic man, emerging out of the colonial period, which is a question of sort of, are they a speculator? This is where this comes from. Are they just involved in trading? Are they creating value? Are they in it for the long haul? Are they in it as investors? Are they going to create jobs and incomes? We all went to Cambridge. We all studied under Keynes and Robinson. And basically we came home and we want that type of economy. How do we get it with these type of people? So this is irreducibly cultural in that sense. And then the international frame on this, of course, coming off of the fact that you've been dealing with the Brits for 120 years and agency firms and rent extraction, colonial drain, the whole thing. This obviously is an enormous colour on the way that anyone's going to think about this, particularly in these moments, but also all the way through. It never changes because as a late developer, you always have that problem of the future is always ahead of you. The technological future is always accelerating. You are always playing catch up. And the traditional, and I'll come back to this at the end, Gerson-Cronian problem is one of scale and capital. But there's another one here which is to do with the scale of character. It's a very, very different way of thinking through that problem. And I think that you allude to this, but I think there's much to it on there. So the take home is essentially that this sort of frame of reference has been banging around India since the 1870s, and it keeps informing things today. And that, when you think about it, is an extraordinary and extremely strong claim. But I think that it's one that's really, really defended well in the book. I think that it completely works. But it's one of those things where, in a sense, I almost wish you shouted it more, right? Because it emerges through the text. And I would love to see a stronger statement of it that says, look, it's dead easy. This little box that they've created for themselves over the past 200 years still operates to frame most of the decisions that we see today. And it's very hard to get out of that box. And that raises questions about the boxes that we all operate in and different boxes around the world. So very briefly, basically, here are the 2x2s. I think this is a great way of organizing the whole thing. Essentially, the top line is basically what's going on in terms of the first binary. So we have speculators, bazaar traders, the trading orientation, bad. Modern captains of industry, production orientation, good. Foreign, neo-imperial, extractive, etc., bad. Developmental partners and technology providers. This never changes. It's just different flavors in different moments. So if we take the late colonial period, what do we have? We have basically the traditional domestic problem is that to the extent there is Indian capital, they're comprador collaborators with the imperials, with the Brits, etc. There are, particularly in the 1910s, 20s, and because of the build-up of World War II, some captains of India. Some of them are associated with Congress. We want more of them, but what we see is something, the speculator, etc., we're not happy with at all. The view of foreign capital is incredibly jaundiced at this point, of course, for natural reasons. But again, there's that recognition, particularly with Nehru, that we need to have technology imports. There's no way around this. So then we get to Nehru's period, and it is exactly the sort of, if you will, the personification of this, rather than being a cultural trope in the figure of the speculator during the war. And then again, the captains of industry coming from particular castes, coming from particular classes. And again, there's still this schizophrenia over FDI that becomes absolutely foundational for the entire project. Then we get through the Nehru period, past Indira Gandhi, and you have this weird period with the Janata Party, whereby you get this reconfiguration of these tropes in a very interesting way. The first one is that the traditional domestic is no longer the individual or the group. It is particular firms, and these firms have been burdened. They've been burdened by this legacy of Nehru and planning, etc. It almost invites itself for a neoliberal reading. You can see how aspects of the Indira Gandhi come into this period here, but then the reaction to it is not, let's do the 1990s. It's in a sense, let's go back and reinvent Gandhi, which is a very interesting thing. And no wonder they got themselves into electoral trouble, because this just doesn't mesh together in any way at all. And again, at the bottom, what we have here is the beginning to grapple with the fact that as a modern and modernized economy, we actually need to engage. And this is the joint ventures that you're talking about, the beginnings of this, and the beginning to think about this and what it means to take on a partner, etc., etc. Then we get into the joint venture period itself. I also agree this is one of the most interesting parts of the book and really dealing with this. What's super interesting here is the double frame that emerges in this point. So on the one hand, you've got exactly as you said with the thumbs up guy, right? So he's a scrappy dude who came on and took him on and did the whole thing, etc. Actually, he just relied on the fact that nobody was there. He made a bunch of rents and he sold out at the first possible opportunity. And what you also point out, and this is just a general, I think, really useful point, is that in any joint venture, because people who talk about development, industrial policy love joint ventures, right, is that there's a race that goes on. And the race that you point out is that I want your tech so I can get into competition with you and eventually displace you. If that's the case, why would I ever want to give you my tech? So that tension there, whether it's 40%, 51%, 60%, open, closed, is always about managing the dynamics of that race between the two. And again, when we look at the interactions in this period between sort of how they view the traditional foreign things, unethical partners, etc., versus ethical joint ventures partners, it's the same but very different. Now, once we get finally into, if you will, the neoliberal period, the FDI liberation piece, we get this played out again in a more traditional way, but again amplified, that basically you have these forward-looking Indian firms and MNCs that are willing to partner under the terms that we deem, and then anyone else who isn't, they're cowboys, etc., one-night stands, so on and so forth. And what's amazing about this, you go along, it's basically just, this is the 1998 to 2005 summary, traders just along for the ride, technology types are good, neo-imperialism again, developmental partners. This is where you started, right? It's the whole thing, the whole period, it never changes. So to go back to the economist thing that you start with, yeah, exactly, because they just don't get it, that this is the frame that the entire thing is operationalized on, regardless of whether the elite is religious, non-religious, left, right, makes no difference. That's the thing that's operative. So in closing, what's generalizable in this framework? So my own work on growth models is probably the most materialist I've been in my career. And I'm sort of feeling myself pulled back to a more sort of constructivist underpinning. So I've been working with Nick Kaliampour and Natalia Nakvi at the LSE on this project on growth models in the Global South. And some of the papers that have been coming in really speak to these issues. One on the Philippines as to how the migrant community, qua people who go abroad and get remittances, are actually seen as an integral part, an extremely important and celebrated part of the national growth model, without which there really wouldn't be one. So there's a whole sort of social construction of what it means to be a foreign worker who goes abroad, et cetera, et cetera. Indonesia, most recently, on the struggle over nickel and upgrading and industrial upgrading, and how that really is tapped into a kind of constructed nationalist sentiment. Malaysia, how they struggle to do the same things given the fact that their growth is based upon contracting multinationals. And that just makes it very difficult to cobble together this type of thing that Indonesia is doing. And finally, Germany, a place where I spent far too much time and is usually a negative case of everything for good reason, gives us sort of another story here, which is, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this, why they don't understand the digital world. Because the economy is made up of big firms that make things you can buy, sell, and drop on your foot. And if you're not doing that, you're doing some kind of bad speculation. And it's absolutely, I'll give you an example of this. I recently did a dissertation in, I think it was Marburg and Max Planck. And it was a great dissertation, did the whole thing, great. Did it by Zoom, it was amazing. Actually worked, amazing. And, signed the forms digitally, and then we're good. And then I get this note. You need to print out the form and sign it, because she doesn't get her dissertation until we receive a copy in the mail. It has to be in the mail. And that's this, right? It's real if it's in the mail, and it's not if it's kind of, virtual in any way. You cite Hirschman, and you made me think about sort of Hirschman. I like to think of the passions and the interests as the construction of the liberal economic subject. And it would be wonderful to do a comparative analysis of the construction of the liberal economic subject in late developers. Right, what is the sort of the equivalent of Indian economic man? Because there is that question, not of human capital, but of human character. There's a wonderful book from a few years ago. I can't remember the guy who did it, but it was about late developers, and what they all have in common is having an elite that actually believes in development. It's that simple. And if you have this intrageneral belief, you have a very hard chance of getting there. But if you don't, you break that, then it's over. And there's something very interesting in that. Gerschenkronen risk, we think about the risk of capital, the scale of capital, the fact that you need banks, that you need to socialize the conditions of investment. But there's also, from this reading, character risk. What if you just have the wrong type of people? What does that mean? What are the nationalist politics that go with that? Maybe one way of interpreting India's nationalist turn is, in fact, through that particular lens, that it's the wrong type of people who are making the important investment decisions. That shift towards that framing you talked about in the advert, absolutely emblematic of that, not just genuflecting to tradition, but basically there's a particular form of acceptable modernity, and it's us, it's not them. Right, that becomes very important. And then you mentioned this as well in closing, that, if you think about sort of the return of the economy of rents, if we think that what the imperial economy was one of classic rent extraction, well, we're all living in it now. And those sort of antinomies can also be drawn across the space. So we can think about sort of, foreign traders and speculators. When you think about, private equity, as you mentioned, asset managers coming in, buying things, rent seeking, never improving, not investing, etc., etc. You think about cloud infrastructure, for example, is a very real thing. People are willing to invest in that, but it only exists because of a virtual thing called AI that we don't really know what it's going to do yet. And different countries' uptakes of this, which Europe's roundly criticised for their lack of investment in AI. Well, we don't know what it does yet. I mean, if the entire American stock market crashes in the next 12 months because it turns out it's $1 trillion fucking misallocation of capital, then we'll be telling a very different story about this. And then finally, crypto, I think, is a wonderful example of this. Like the countries that love crypto, right? Some of them do it because they're desperate, right? So El Salvador is a great example of this. You de facto dollarize, you have no monetary policy space, you've got incredibly high cost of capital. Let's try crypto, right? But the reception of crypto in sort of the Anglosphere versus, for example, Europe is very interesting. Because again, it's this idea that these are not real things. This is not real investment. Whereas that speculative play, so long as it makes profit, so long as I can bank the cash, that is the end result rather than investment. It's a classic Weberian distinction. And it's there in black and white. So I love the book. I applaud you for writing it. I think it's a classic. I want lots of people to read it. And for two reasons. One, you will finally know what the hell you're talking about when you talk about India, which is good. And the second one is because I think that all of the stuff I've been talking on the back end is just waiting to be written out of it as projects. This is very generative for everybody else. So knock it out of the park. Thank you.